So as we heard, energy, which in itself is an immensely important subject, has an interesting symbiotic or lack of it relationship with NAFTA. And North American energy has a lot of issues, but a lot of opportunities. I'm going to turn the floor over to Tom Stevenson, who amongst his many functions and accomplishments co-chairs with George a task force here on energy that has been really, really helpful to bring to light greater information based on sound science and good economics about issues and options, and not only currently, but about potential energy futures. So,
my co-chairman left?
He's going to be back.
I thought what I would do is make a couple of sort of macro observations, and before I turn it over to our two panelists. And they're really in the spirit of what my co-conspirator, Mr. Schultz, was talking about at lunch, namely the emergence of North America as a true entity and marketplace. And I always like to think about energy through the lens of a three-legged stool. Jim calls this his triangle, but it's to look at things from the perspective of national security, economic security, and environmental security. And it's interesting when you do that, and particularly when you think about the impact. It's been an eventful 20 years for energy within North America, but particularly the last 5 or 6 years, when we've begun to see the huge impact in so many ways of new approaches to exploring for unconventional oil and gas, the so-called fracking revolution. And when you think about the impact that has had, first on national security, there's no question but that North America is rapidly increasing towards a position of relative energy independence. Certainly, if you go back 10 or 15 years, we don't spend a lot of time worrying about OPEC today, certainly in the context or to the extent that we used to. When you look at it from an economic security standpoint, certainly has had a very positive impact on the North American trade balance sheet. Certainly a lot less money flowing to other parts of the world and than what's going on just within North America, and what's helping us as we North America begin to export more in terms of natural resources. And from an environmental security perspective, the principal impact we'd have to say is the substitution of natural gas for coal, and the very positive impact that is having on CO2 emissions throughout North America. A lot of this unconventional oil and gas is being developed today in the United States and Canada, very little in Mexico, more flow of natural gas to Mexico. But there's no question that when you look at North America as a whole, that the fracking revolution is having a dynamic impact on the three key elements of thinking about energy. From a trade facilitation and trade barrier standpoint, probably the two key issues that we should talk about today, and I know Jim's going to spend some time on the XL Pipeline. I suspect Michael will as well.
Why would you say that?
But it is an important trade issue, and one with lots of impacts, and certainly some controversy to it in terms of the environmental impacts, but we will talk about that, I'm sure, at some length. And then the other issue is what's going on, and as Jaime referred to earlier, the changes in Mexico's approach to energy, because there's no question that the limitations on investment in Mexican energy today are a constraint on full development of resources. How that's going to shake out, it's fairly clear that if it's nothing more than profit sharing, it's not going to have a big impact. You got to get production into the equation. Jaime pointed out at a meeting we recently attended, a symposium on North America, the revenue implications are non-trivial for Mexico here as well, and I'll let him maybe talk a little bit about them during the discussion period. So with that, let me turn it over to our panelists. I'm not going to reintroduce Michael because I assume he was well introduced this morning. Jim doesn't need a lot of introduction. Basically, Jim and I have been working together on energy issues for at least a dozen years, going back to the electricity crisis. If it's at Stanford and it has anything to do with energy policy, you can be sure that Jim's involved, whether it's Hoover, whether it's SEPR, whether it's Precourt, whether it's Freeman Spogli. Jim is in the middle of it. And so with that, let me turn it over to Jim to start the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. As he suggested, we've worked together a long time, but not nearly as long as the time I knew Jaime at the time, when we were both young faculty members together. All of us had nice dark-colored hair. And I'll stop on that one. But
energy must be the most difficult since the three of the four white-haired guys in the room.
I just want to go back to the NAFTA text, remind the negotiators. Article 1, eliminate barriers, promote competition. It didn't say, and it said facilitate. It didn't say get rid of all problems. It said facilitate. And strengthen and then when we get to Chapter 6 and principles, they recognize it is desirable to strengthen the important role of trade in energy, petrochemicals. But for Mexico, there was another provision. The parties confirmed the full respect for their constitutions, and NAFTA does not include all energy. There's some energy in there. With Canada, it does include all energy. I'm going to, as we go through, give some data that may suggest that this has led to some very positive consequences for Mexico and for Canada, maybe some negative consequences for Mexico as you go along. But Jaime's the one who knows much more about Mexico, and he will comment on it. And let me talk about an idealized interpretation. I'm not an international trade guy, so I don't deal with a lot of the details. Like when we deal with energy, we don't think about rules of origin very much. They're really easy. If the oil's coming from Canada, it's been produced in Canada. I mean, no confusion about it. So I like to go back to just a simple idealized version of a well-functioning NAFTA. And I will keep coming back to this, even though this is not the language that's carefully negotiated by negotiators. It's that the decisions between the three nations should be made as if there are no national boundaries between the producer and consumers. That's right down to that. That's my idealized vision. Forget that there's national boundaries. Now, that doesn't mean that it's only commercial considerations, because as we have things within a nation, we pay attention to a lot of other things other than just the commercial things. I talk about the energy policy triangle, which with energy policy is really a trade-off between the economic issues, the environmental issues, and the security issues. So NAFTA should still take into account the idea that those are all existing. It's just ideally do so as if there are no national boundaries in between. And that's sort of a high barrier to get through. But I'd like to then argue that for energy trade between Canada and U.S., that ideal pretty much is operating with one sore thumb at the end of the time, which I'll talk to when that's the Keystone XL Pipeline. Between Mexico and U.S., the trade itself seems consistent in the commodities, but Mexican regulatory issues have been limiting investment flows, may limit the own economic capabilities, and I can't prove, but I suggest that in the North American energy revolution that's going about, Mexico's been left behind, and partly because they have not made sharp changes in their constitution, but it's their constitution, not ours. So the sore issue is the one sore issue in which we are operating not as if there were no national boundaries, is in the Keystone XL Pipeline. I'm going to come back to that to the end because we're right in the midst of presidential and congressional politics in the middle of what of that decision. And then I know Michael Wilson will say more about that afterwards. So let's look at some of the data here. Natural gas trade. Notice it's peaked. This is monthly data that we have, and notice that it's peaked around the year 2000, 2004 through 6 is flattened out. The imports of natural gas into the United States, and it's been declining over time. But notice that the black line and the red line are just about the same. The net U.S. imports and the net U.S. imports from Canada, basically most of the natural gas that the United States gets is from Canada. But you look at the blue and purple line, we do import liquefied natural gas, LNG, and now we've moved to a net exporter of natural gas to Mexico. And Mexico has had tremendous natural gas reserves, but now U.S. has become a next exporter to natural gas. If you put this in a cumulative chart to look at exports and imports, you see the green and yellow is the green is exports to Canada, then I added onto it cumulatively to Mexico. So you see that it's a two-way trade. It's not just a one-way trade from natural gas from Canada to the U.S. U.S. also exports natural gas to Canada, and that's been quite a to U.S. exports natural gas to Canada and imports it from Canada, and basically exports it to Mexico right now. And so if you look at the net North American natural gas imports, a rough approximation is that black right at the top is the net. So for natural gas, we're basically self-sufficient as when you add the three together. One of the things I look at to ask if there's trade barriers or what the price is going in the opposite direction, and you notice this is between Canada and U.S. monthly data. Prices move the same, but the important thing is, notice natural gas prices have varied from $2 up to $12 per 1,000 cubic feet, and down to about $2.50 or $3 now. The market has been working exactly the way you want a natural resource market to work. Prices go up and down with market conditions. Very, very healthy market is happening in natural gas. So therefore, the trade value of natural gas to Canada, between Canada and the U.S., has plummeted very sharply. Simply because the price of natural gas has gone down with normal market forces. The quantities that we in the United States import from Canada is going down. So now this is monthly data. So we're down to about $500 million per month. Pretty small from times where we had about $4 billion a month trade. So the trade balances have been moving around sharply between Canada and the U.S. And between Mexico and U.S., it's tiny. It's very small numbers. But this is not in your sheets. It's the shale revolution. What's happened is the shale revolution. U.S. has been producing a lot of natural gas from shale. So if you look at the data, the estimates of how much is available, and that's that third column, technically recovered shale gas resources. U.S. is the biggest of the three, but Mexico's not far behind. So if you look at what the geologists are saying is the potential for Mexico, Mexico may have a lot of potential for producing natural gas from shale. I don't know whether they'll actually be able to produce it, just as we didn't know whether the U.S. was going to be able to produce it. But Mexico has their movement in terms of production of all gas. Notice that they're 1.8 trillion cubic feet. Canada is 5.6, U.S. 20.6. So Mexican, at least when you go to the shale gas revolution, the geological estimates is they've had a lot. Whether Mexico is going to exploit that or not and engage fully in the trade is some decisions that are going to be internal to Mexico. Electricity. Canada imports, we have significant imports of electricity from Canada to the United States. We have exports to Canada. Notice that we have trade with Mexico. See that two lowest line, that's electricity trade between Mexico and U.S. And these are gross values. These are not net values. These are total values. So again, in the electricity market, Canada and U.S. have become very aggressive trading partners. Mexico has not. But I want to put this as sort of a monthly data. And again, if you look at it, it's not just a constant flow. Electricity, the quantities are going up and down in a very robust way, depending upon hour by hour, day by day, week by week changes in market conditions. Again, a sign of an extremely healthy electricity market. The important part of this movement back and forth is really hidden by any aggregate statistics of the net trade. Because electricity is a particular commodity, particular characteristic, you can't store it. Or it's very expensive to store it in a battery. So that there's times when it has a very high value south of the Canadian border, other times it has a particularly high value north of the border. So you can envision a lot of trade flow. What's especially different between the synergies between Canada and the U.S. is Canada is dominantly a hydropower system, which has a limitation on how much energy over time, but they can store water in a reservoir, and it's just like a very big battery because you can choose when to store it. U.S. is mostly a thermal system, and you can't store it. So you have lots of opportunity for the equivalent of arbitrage between the two. So on net, you may see very little flow, net flows, and a very high value. This is data from British Columbia to the U.S., and you just see it's roughly on balance over time, and yet there's a very high value for both sides because the hydro system of British Columbia is complementary to the thermal system of the United States, and you can get those net gains. The North American coal trade works the other direction. U.S. exports coal to Canada, and I'm going to come back to this because there's the trade dispute about Keystone is about importing this good that is high carbon dioxide content when you burn it. And coal has a much higher carbon dioxide content than electricity does. This is small quantities, but notice that we export, U.S. exports coal to Canada. It imports a little bit from Canada, And there is a blue line as imports from Mexico. It's a little hard to see because it looks like it's along the axis, because it is along the axis. Notice that there's an increase of coal exports. This, by the way, is mostly to the European countries. As we're moving away from coal, which releases carbon dioxide in the United States, we're exporting it to the European countries who now are burning that coal. And the biggest consumer is one of the biggest countries we export it to is one of the most environmentally loud countries, and that's the Netherlands. We're sending our coal to them. So price is about $100, $120 per short ton. So this is very small. It's between Canada and the United States. It's in the order of $1 billion a year. So that's not very, very important. Petroleum. Again, notice the difference. The exports from Canada continue to grow at a quite rapid rate. Exports from Canada to the United States. From Mexico, Canada and Mexico used to be about the same. Now Canada, Mexico is about 1/6 as large as United States as gross imports to the United States. But then look at the green is imports from the United States to Mexico of petroleum, crude oil, and products. It's almost equal to the amount of exports. So again, over time, Mexico has become very small elements of the U.S. trade in even petroleum, and Pemex is one of the. This is the national patrimony of Mexico. If you look at petroleum net imports, we can have net imports from Canada adding to it in Mexico, and the total black is the U.S. You notice that downward trend, the middle, the black area, is approximately the North American oil dependency. We've heard reference earlier that we're rapidly moving to a situation of North American oil self-sufficiency. And this figure shows it quite dramatically with the fracking that's bringing in new oil supplies as well as new natural gas supplies. We are as a North America, moving towards self-sufficiency. And the people who are making predictions about the future are predicting, they have a little disagreement about what year we're going to get to self-sufficiency, but not whether we're going to get to self-sufficiency. We're talking about, if you're looking at this, within 5 years or 10 years, we expect to get in that situation. This also depends upon fuel efficiency standards for automobiles, and it will depend very sharply on the Keystone XL Pipeline. Let me get back to that. So if you look at the total trade values of all of those, the big line up there is value of net exports of Canada to the United States. About $80 billion is oil. The rest of them is quantitatively small, but strategically, particularly the electricity, large, because failure to have, say, electricity when you need it leads to blackouts. And we saw that in the Western electricity crisis, where I would argue strongly that the electricity exports from British Columbia is why California had only a very small number of blackouts rather than having a large number of blackouts in the electricity area. So there's a strategic interest there that goes well beyond the dollar sense. But if you want to have a dollar sense in terms of trade, $80 billion of net exports to U.S. Looking at comparison to the total data, all U.S. exports, merchandise exports, would be about $324 billion. Exports, that's from Canada to Canada, 293. So when you're talking about $80 billion, this is a big chunk of that. The net flow between the two in all trade is about 31 billion for merchandise trade between the two. So when we're talking about $80 billion for oil alone, it's a big deal, big important of it. So it's robust except for this very sore, robust between Canada and the United States. Mexico and the United States, their own internal issues, I think, are limiting their development of those resources. And as I've suggested in the idea of a generalized NAFTA, it's as if there are no borders. It doesn't mean each country will do everything the same. And it doesn't mean that they will treat environmental trade-offs the same or regulatory rules the same, but as if there are no borders. Just let us say a couple minutes about the Keystone XL Pipeline here. You've all heard about it, but you may not have seen all the details of it. It's a pipeline system that's bringing oil both from Canada to the Gulf Coast and from northern parts of the United States to our Gulf Coast. The green parts are already constructed. That's not the controversy. The controversy is that red dotted line that would bring in oil, and it's talking about 830,000 barrels per day. If you multiply that by $100, that's about I can't even do the arithmetic. I can't even multiply by 100 on my, but so it's about $25 billion a year that we're talking about. So it's, again, big number in scale. This is not an insignificant issue. But as opposed to everything else where it's a normal trade going on, this requires a presidential approval. So what's happening? The proponents see, and I'm a proponent, see national security and economic benefits of the Keystone XL Pipeline. The more we have better trade in oil, this strategic commodity here, the better national security issues we have, and the economic benefits are quite real. The opponents see greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands, which old-timers like me call tar sands, but you know, that's socially unacceptable these days, so is oil sands, and will assert other environmental risk of the pipeline. What?
Bitumen.
Yeah, bitumen, yes. Will assert other environmental risks of moving oils by pipeline, even though all of the evidence is that the safest way of moving oil is by pipeline, much safer than by trains or any other way that you might moving it. So the question in my mind is, okay, what if we didn't have the pipeline? What would be the consequence? My belief is that Canada will produce just about as much oil, but ship it by rail, some to the United States, at a cost of $6 to $10 a barrel more, and with more environmental damage and more risk of moving it by rail, or they can expand some pipelines that go to the west and ship it to China, and we lose national security benefits. We gain nothing from the environment by shutting it down, but it's become a massive symbolic issue. You can compare it with, if you're worried about global climate change, you can compare the carbon dioxide per unit of energy to the coal we export to Canada, and note that we're exporting a more energy-intense commodity than the one that we find acceptable to import from Canada. And Venezuela heavy oil is, again, similar carbon dioxide. Quantifying, by the way, how much more greenhouse gases may be associated at the production side with the oil from the tar sands. It's maybe 10 to 15% more than the average of U.S. oil. So we're not talking about massive differences. We're talking about 10 to 15%, which is in the region, which is right in the area of variability of other oil that we import, particularly from Venezuela. But this is going to require a presidential decision, become the one sore point, and the decision seems to be made right now, being held up by what appears to me is basically presidential and congressional political considerations, not basic environmental or security or energy issues, even though this has become a symbol for some environmentalists who are willing to be arrested for this, what I believe is a symbol.
Happening, Jim, is that the president is performing what might be called a pocket veto. He's not taking any action. Doesn't want to face up to it. And the result of that is everybody involved is about to cancel the pipeline and go other ways, so I've been told. But this is a tragedy. I was Secretary of Labor and given the job by the president to study the oil import program in 1969. And we could easily see that there was instability in the Middle East due to Arab-Israeli tensions. And we made a number of recommendations for what to do about it. None were accepted. So I'm Secretary of the Treasury in 1973. Along comes exactly what we said we should watch out for. Now, anybody that thinks the Middle East is a region of great stability right now must be living somewhere else. And so here we have oil that doesn't go through the Strait of Hormuz. It's a no-brainer, absolute no-brainer. But it's, I'm afraid it's just drifting. And the president will be able to kill it by just not doing anything, which is characteristic.
And that's why I leave as the last point, my slides. I believe it's time we move forward with the pipeline approval and eliminate what I view as a very sore and deep issue that is moving us away from what I view as an idealized vision of NAFTA, that the decisions on energy trade between the three nations should be made as if there are no national boundaries between them. And we have, I didn't use the word national tragedy, but I would not disagree with those characteristics. It's time to move ahead on that, and it's time for the president to make a positive decision. On that, I will turn it over to a person who I expect is going to disagree with me fully on that.
Before Michael starts, let me just reiterate one thing, and I mentioned this briefly, but not probably enough. Because we made the unusual decision for this room to have live streaming, the live streaming occurs the sound is off of this microphone. This is the microphone for in here. So sometimes I'm motioning you to do both. That's what I'm trying to get you to make sure you can be heard both in your live streaming and in the room.
Well, first of all, Jim, if you're going to be one of our most outspoken proponents, you have to get rid of the tar sands reference. I mean, yeah.
I don't say that in public.
No, that's good.
This is Chatham House rules for tar sands reference.
It's not Chatham House rules. It's going everywhere.
I know. It's oil sands.
I'll make a few points which may duplicate what Jim has just said, but thank you, Jim, for your strong support and position on the Keystone Pipeline. Up until now, I think this comes through from Jim's presentation, the energy trade flows between the United States and Canada for as long as we've had oil, which goes back to 1957, and for all the energy that we export by means of natural gas and electricity, it's very, very smooth. We have one issue that stands in the way. In fact, that is the main issue between the United States and Canada. Thanks to the NAFTA and the Dispute Settlement Agreement, the trade flows between the two countries is remarkably quiet. Even softwood lumber has gone quiet, although that bubbles up periodically. But that's why this is such got such a high profile, is because it's unusual, and we don't see these things happening. I've got a few things in this. This is a few basics in the market. You can see on the top left that we've got exports are increasing between the United States and Canada, and that's going to continue to increase. I'll say a little later on that between now and 2030, we're going to have 2 million barrels a day more of oil, and that creates a real problem if we have this attitude towards increased flows continue. What I think is important is another factor here. Look at the two bar charts to the right side of that one on the top left. You can see what the gaps in exports is quite significant, and that is a market-based issue that we have to deal with. It has nothing to do with any regulations. It has everything to do with what's happening in the shale gas revolution. And you can see on the next chart, the top right, you can see how the amount of shale gas in the United States is swamping what we are producing in Canada, what we're selling into the United States. So that's a significant issue. I put in on the lower right or lower left the Alberta Clipper issue. This was approved in September of 2009. And the same sort of considerations were in place there with the Department of State analysis of this. And they came out, and on the one hand, we have national security of supply, and the other hand, we have the environmental issues. And they had a good analysis of the importance of both of those and came down with a pretty balanced set of views on the side of the Alberta Clipper oil pipeline should go ahead. Not a large pipeline, but certainly the same considerations. And as I say there, it's largely from the oil sands as well. The Keystone XL is it's very troublesome. As George just said, it's a pocket veto. It's something that is very frustrating because we have good supporters in the United States, but the environmental opponents of this are very vociferous and have gained a lot of attention and will continue to gain attention as the delay continues. But I'd say it's quite ironic. You just remember the chart that Jim showed on the coal exports just skyrocketing. Well, that's causing some real problems in Europe because it's in some of the European countries who are the major recipients of this are not able to meet their environmental targets, and it's the cheap coal from the United States that the electric companies are buying and have to buy because it makes business sense for them to do that. But it's the combination of the Keystone issue, which is a politically motivated position, and the market issue of shale gas, which has presented Canada with I think it's a watershed decision from a point where all of our oil and all of our natural gas with relatively minimal leakage there has gone to one market, the United States. And we are being forced now for market reasons, but also for political reasons to consider alternatives. The resource is too important. When you have the size of energy flows that we do have, and the 2 million barrels a day that's on target to be available, it's something we cannot ignore. And the result is that we're going to have to look elsewhere to sell that energy. So this chart shows the options that we have. On the oil side, we have that 2 million barrels a day coming on stream. We've got the third largest oil reserves in the world. 97% of these are in those oil sands. And we've got to look, if we can't sell it into the United States, we've got to look to Asia, to India, to Europe, and it will probably result in certainly a diversion of the balance between the United States and these other countries, and may well result in lower volumes going to the United States as a result. If we don't get that increased capacity, we're going to be forced to do this because we just can't leave it in the ground. On natural gas, it's as I said, it's a market-based issue that we have to deal with. What we're looking at here is LNG exports, or exports through some upgrading into petrochemicals, urea, and things like that. And there are several LNG terminals that are being proposed for our west coast. There is a significant infrastructure challenge there, which I'll come back to in a moment, but we simply must make these decisions, and we must make them soon because of the time to get that infrastructure in place. I think, though, that this North American integration will continue. You need the energy. We have, I think it's something like 30 natural gas pipelines between the two countries, and 20 oil pipelines. The existing capacity there is 3.6 million barrels a day, and the 3.2 million barrels per day of production certainly can be handled by that. But as these new projects come on stream, that's going to quickly increase. What we are looking at is 3 million barrels a day of proposed capacity. It's a significant amount, but where do we put it? How can we do anything north-south, or do we have to go east or west? I just got a couple of points here that I don't think Jim made them. For every 2 oil sands jobs created in Canada, there's 1 that will be created in the United States. So there's an economic reason, and our numbers are 440,000 incremental U.S. jobs by 2035. Now, the box in the right there demonstrates really what the balance in the decision is. Offshore will provide us with flexibility, and quite frankly, flexibility in future bargaining. You remember the pipeline chart that showed the 2 existing Trans-Canada pipelines, one coming down through North Dakota. North Dakota shortly will be your number 2 producing oil state after Texas, and that's the crossover comes in a couple of years' time. That state is very important to you, and the Trans-Canada pipeline going through that state takes a lot of Bakken oil down to the Oklahoma and Gulf Coast refineries. I jokingly say to myself, well, why don't we just ship all Canadian oil through that pipeline and demonstrate that we are important to the broader energy interests of the United States, but there's probably a good reason why we don't do that. On the bottom box there, I talk about the major infrastructure challenge that we need to face up to. This is not going to be easy for us. We have environmentalists in Canada, surprise, and there are a lot of people who are going to make sure that everything is taken into account in those the environmental hearings. The government has put in place a system whereby all of the approvals will be the subject of one hearing, so that the different interested regulators will be involved in that one hearing in order to speed up the process. And they're trying to hold to some timelines that would be agreed at the outset for those approvals. The other issue, which is becoming, I think, one of our most important national issues, is that the First Nations have put the country on notice that they're not going to let any of these pipelines that go to the West Coast, LNG terminals or pipelines that on the West Coast, basically pipelines for BC, unless they get some treaty claims approved that have been outstanding for a long, long time. And that, I think, is probably going to be a bigger challenge to us than the environmental issue. They've been making some very strong statements recently, and there's certainly grounds for them to take the positions that they have. All First Nations aren't the same. Some are more willing to be commercially oriented in their treatment of these, but there will be some along the routes that will be much more hawkish as they treat these. But let me go back to looking at this as a North American region. I put on this chart a number of boxes that show the benefits if we can become a self-sufficient global energy leader in natural gas and oil. We're there in natural gas, as Jim's charts have shown. Collectively, the three countries can be, by 2020, I think, fully self-sufficient in oil. So we've got lower cost advantages, but we also have availability advantages that I think will accrue to our benefit. The environmental side, I think that this can be done with a positive North American impact. We have put in, as I said, this new project review process. Some in the United States have been saying that's something that the United States should adopt. And the impact on economic productivity, partly in view of the significant infrastructure projects that we have to do. Jaime's going to talk about the current status of the constitutional reform in Mexico. That's a very key component to this whole picture. But I think here, and this I think is the most important box on this page here, that is to have an open trilateral dialogue so that we understand the issues that each country is dealing with and can take this into account, not as a single decision-making process, but as a guide to what we can do to develop these resources and meet the needs of the North American economy in the most effective way. And as I say at the bottom there, at a minimum, avoid energy policies or regulations that can upset the normal flows. So the final chart is moving forward here. I think this energy revolution, which is really turning the whole industry on its ear, it's underway, and it shows every signs of being capable of continuing for quite a while. It's shale. We've got this Keystone XL challenge, which is more than just one pipeline. It's a signal that it sends to us for future pipelines, and then what's happening in Mexico. So my conclusion here is I think if we can come up with this energy dialogue, earlier today there was some discussion of an energy agreement. I'm not sure that that's not a bridge too far. I'm not sure what it would entail. But at a minimum, I think it is very important that we put in place a capacity to exchange views on what is happening and take into account the different perspectives of the three countries, and do that through an ongoing, continuing high-level dialogue. But picking up on a point that George made earlier, leadership in this one is absolutely critical. And the three countries have got to agree at a very senior level to do this if it's going to be an effective approach.
Michael, thank you.
Should we let Jaime?
Yeah, I was
make some
going to,
comments?
Jaime, why don't,
Developments in Mexico.
we're all watching this on kind of a real-time basis as to what's happening constitutionally and its impact on energy
I'm not
reform.
an energy specialist, so I'll try to be very brief. As we speak, the Mexican Senate is discussing and debating a constitutional change that my understanding is that it has changed from the original proposal the government sent. The original proposal the government, Peña Nieto, sent was to change 2 words in the Constitution, and in an article where both licenses and production sharing were forbidden. So the whole idea was these things will be forbidden for private activity, and then just leave one that is licenses. Apparently, after the debate with the PAN, which is the party to the right, they had sent a more aggressive proposal, which is to allow for everything, for licenses, production sharing, profit sharing, and so on. And they are going to do it. The final proposal that came in last night, I think Mary is more onto this, was yesterday, right?
Actually, Saturday afternoon. Yesterday they were doing the markup, and today they're working on the markup.
Yeah.
Real time.
Real time. And so what they are doing now is not only going for licenses as well, so the full opening of the energy, but they are putting in the Constitution certain procedures. Wow. Because the problem was that everybody was saying that those letters or those words could be changed, but then implementing legislation was going to take a huge debate, and they might lose that debate in the implementing legislation. So in a very non-orthodox way, they are making the changes of certain elements that would ideally belong to an implementing legislation in the Constitution.
And the PAN and the PRI have the votes to
For a
accomplish
constitution,
this?
for a constitutional change, Tom, you need 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House. The PRI and the PAN have it. And then you need a simple majority of state legislatures, which the PAN and the PRI have. So it's not a matter of numbers now, votes. I think that is, it's quite possible that happens. The left, that is the PRD, the López Obrador had a heart attack a week ago. Mm-hmm. And given the sort of idea, funny politics in Mexico, some people are saying that it was an induced heart attack so that he couldn't fight against this measure. That joke has disappeared from the press. But the reading I have is that even if it's not orthodox to make all those changes in the Constitution, it might be the only way to do it right now, which eventually will reflect in the implementing legislation. Now, how quickly will the market react to this? Because this is very important. I've talked to some of the large companies in the US, and they say that they have 2 sine qua non conditions for them to start moving projects. The first one is the ability for companies that invest in Mexico under this new regime to book reserves. Reserve booking is absolutely essential for them, because otherwise their value can be affected, and the market will react to their shares.
That's in the transitory article.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But the problem is that the reason in that transitory article is that the government is claiming that the reserves still belong to the state.
Right. Yes.
So they are already talking to the SEC, the companies, to see what they need, even if you have that sort of ideological principle that the reserves belong to the state, so that you can book them. So that's challenge number one, which is not a minor one. Not in terms of the change itself, but the companies doing it. And the second one, which I was very surprised when I heard it, but now thinking about it, and after Stephen's presentation makes so much sense, they don't want to deal with the oil union. I don't want to get involved with those guys, and they are right to do so. Because it's a very corrupt union, it's a complicated union, so they are going to have to put pressure on the Labor Department in Mexico so that if you are a private investor in energy, you have your own union, and you don't have one union for the whole sector, which is what the current union wanted to do. And that's a big issue. I think they'll resolve it as well.
So it's effectively a public service union today?
Today, there is a monopoly, and the union that works for the monopoly works for the whole industry. And they want to keep having that sort of power of working for the whole industry, even though you are a private investor once you open up. So this is a complicated issue, politically complicated, but I'm afraid. Yes,
Can I
Mary.
ask you a question about that? Because it's my impression that the pension fund is totally unfunded. The liabilities are unfunded.
In the union?
Yeah, so is that a negotiating possibility for the government? Because, I mean, if Peña Nieto says to the union, well, by the way, you don't have any money, and then they're willing to trade some concession, it seems to me like that might be something they could.
Yeah, I'll tell you off the record my view on that one, because it's something that I don't do. I mean, I don't talk, I don't study, but
I mean, this is being live streamed.
well, semi off the record. I think that putting the boss of the education and the teachers union into jail is a much stronger than the pension funds.
Salinas did that too, didn't he?
Yes, yeah. So I think that can be tackled that way. I don't know, but it's an issue. It's an issue. So my reading, I mean, we'll know in the next 2 or 3 days, but I couldn't agree more with Jim and with Michael. Mexico has to be in this formula here. Yeah. My recommendation is that we don't do it through NAFTA. Actually, you put some quotes on the NAFTA text, Jim, that are very interesting, but you miss one. And that's probably the most complicated one. And is that it says there in chapter that you have some guarantee of supply. That is, if, for instance, Canada tomorrow lowers their production by 1 billion barrels or 1 million barrels, you guys, the Canadians, keep on exporting the same proportion you were exporting to the U.S.
Proportion is the key.
It's a proportion.
Yeah.
That was too complicated.
No,
for me to deal
but
with.
no. But let me finish.
OPEC.
Yeah.
A little, no, but let me finish because this is interesting. You see an annex in Article 625 that it says this condition applies to all the parties, but not to Mexico. So Mexico did not go for the guarantee. Thinking when we negotiated this, that was a very delicate issue, but also that we were the surplus country. With your projections, it's not clear that we're going to be the surplus country, so probably we were shooting our own foot with this sort of exception. But the point is, it goes beyond. If we were to link the current energy reform in Mexico with the NAFTA proposal, we would not help the reform in Mexico. We would hurt. If American companies start talking about investing in Mexico too soon, we will not help the process. It will complicate it. So I think that Mexico is going to need a year or so after this change to start bringing the issue to the North American formula. And it will happen. But I think they're going to have to manage it with great care. Because it's going to be a complicated political situation after this is approved, which I'm pretty sure it will be approved. I don't say more because I don't know much about this.
One of the things you talked about a couple of weeks ago was how does the Mexican government make up the revenue stream that comes from oil and gas today if some of this is being diverted into revenues and profits for those developing the resources from U.S. and elsewhere.
For this reform to happen, Mexico, does not depend on oil on exports anymore, but it depends for public finance.
Right.
1/3 of the revenues the government earns comes from energy. Now they introduce an aggressive tax reform a few weeks ago to raise revenues from indirect taxation and corporate income tax to compensate
Okay.
for the taxes they're going to sacrifice with the opening of Pemex. So hopefully they'll be able to manage over time that issue.
The oil and gas in Canada is owned by the provinces.
What do you mean?
Well, they own the resource.
How do you book? Then how,
Alberta owns the oil sands.
So if Imperial or Exxon comes in there, they just get the right to produce the oil, to explore and produce on a certain property.
and they can
But
book the reserves?
the ownership is still with the province.
But can they put in their balance the reserves?
I presume,
the value of the
I
reserves?
presume that,
Yes, that is,
is with the province?
yeah.
that has been worked out. I don't know whether it's interacted with the production sharing agreement or not, but definitely Exxon is booking reserves from Curl, for example.
Well, that is a sort of condition that the main producers have, and I think it makes sense. In Mexico, the concept of owning your reserves is a bit more complicated than it is in Canada. People see it as as their own property.
But I mentioned that to you.
No,
as-
because
as
it might be the formula there.
As
yeah.
a model that they may.
Yeah.
be
And on the
looking
shale
at.
gas, very quickly, the shale gas will be open, I think, no matter what shape takes the reform, because everybody realizes that it's essential. Electricity is going to be fully open, which I think is very good news and has not been debated dramatically. And that, I think, is going to allow us to enter into this North American formula with time.
Sounds like with time it's going to get good.
Yes. But I mean, time, I don't, you're not
Yeah.
talking about decades. You're talking probably things cooling down a little bit and so on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I make a couple of quick comments. One, being on the board of an energy company, I can tell you, Rod, the SEC comment letter most commonly received is about reserve bookings. So the SEC is always inquiring about how this. A few years ago, Shell, which is generally regarded as a pretty well-run company, and none of them are perfect, had a big scandal about this that cost the CEO his job.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's
what
a
is the
very
issue? What is
sensitive
the
issue.
the SEC
Well,
makes?
the question is, what criteria are you using? You find the oil. Well, you go from finding, discovering a prospect, estimating what's there, then estimating what is economically, commercially recoverable from it, under what terms and what time period, et cetera. So we have all.
Transition from
So-
resources to reserves?
Yes, but it's more complicated than that.
There's estimation.
Yeah, what
about
is
what's
gonna be the
economically
price?
attractive.
So-
and it's how you estimate it makes a big deal. Of
So
difference.
yeah, that's exactly right, and the SEC got very interested in the corporation's oversight of the individual engineering teams and what they were doing and so on. So this is a big deal. Also for gas, they demand you calculate economically recoverable based on the natural gas prices on December 31st. And I can tell you in the case of Exxon, they always say, well, we're being required to tell people about how we run our business, and we don't run our business based on the gas price on one day. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of tensions of that sort. So it's a legitimate business issue. And I would say in the last few years, firms that have aggressively booked have been rewarded for that in the marketplace. They're now starting to have problems about whether they can produce. And those that have conservatively booked have been dinged. So there's always this tension about how to do that.
Michael, for the SEC, it should only be a disclosure issue.
Yeah.
It should not be an
Well,
economic issue.
There's both a disclosure issue, and they demand certain ways you calculate it so it's consistent across firms. And they're therefore requiring some well-run companies to state a number that they think is ridiculous, for example.
But it becomes how they disclose
Yeah,
it and
yeah,
how they
yeah,
deal. But something that's inherently uncertain, and it's one deterministic number and something that's inherently uncertain.
I want to make a couple of other comments on this excellent discussion, because I think you have to think of North American energy. We did this a little bit in the context of global energy. From my own perspective, the shale revolution, oil sands, and the prospect of Mexico opening up to foreign investment, which I'll say more about in a moment, is one of the great geopolitical shifts in our favor in my lifetime, and will greatly reduce the power of OPEC. And I think it's immensely important. We could get more power out of that. We can get more value out of that on the natural gas side if we were permitting export terminals and we're creating more of a global market. Natural gas is $9 to $12 in Europe, $15 in Japan. That's $3 here. And it's very hard to get an export terminal approved. A while ago, before the shale revolution, all these same companies were trying to permit import terminals. Now they're trying to permit export terminals. But if you want to do something that really helps global stability, figure out a way to get more natural gas to Europe from somewhere besides Russia. My opinion, for example. So I think that's another no-brainer. I think it's also important to appreciate, I'm not a geologist and a petroleum engineer, but there's large natural field declines. So to produce the same amount of oil or natural gas as we're producing today, 10 years from now, requires us to find and discover and hence invest an immense amount to stay even. So it's important to understand that the target's moving. We're getting less and less from Alaska, for example, the North Sea, and so on. So, and then we have this kind of complicated issues with the environment, which we have the opportunity to get it bailed out of in the medium term with natural gas subbing out coal. But it's going to be a while before we can get alternatives that scale to significance environmentally or economically. The energy industry is so vast, it's almost unimaginable how much energy is produced and consumed. We're talking about trillions and trillions of any measure you want to use per year. And it's so vast that it's going to be a while before we get alternatives that are available at a scale without massive government subsidies to totally distort everything, that we can rely less on oil, for example. That will be a good thing when it finally happens. But in the meantime, I think the politics of it are very complex. You can have an aggressive, in my view, economically, scientifically, and numerically literate policy. But the notion that you're just going to shut off oil right now, for example, or you're going to shut off oil sands right now, for example, I think just doesn't pass that common sense test I was talking about. So you've got to figure out a way to talk in, and I think people who are experts in this would kind of agree with it, you've got to figure out a way to talk to the public about it, not just being a binary choice between this, that, or the other, but actually trying to manage the policy infrastructure so we have a sensible set of environmental and economic outcomes over time.
Michael, I think your comments about the geopolitical significance of these developments is right on the mark, but I think it goes further. Because if there are accompanying declines in price, then you have Saudi Arabia, which is basically existing on gigantic subventions, and they'll be strained. You have Russia, which is a state-dependent, heavily dependent, and
Pardon me.
They will have to pipe down a little bit, and so on. So there are huge implications for people to think through about what this means if it's allowed to proceed. Obviously, there are huge roadblocks. The Keystone Pipeline is an example, but there are lots of other roadblocks, people who don't want this to happen.
And just add to it, on the demand side of the market, we're beginning to explore with cars that don't use oil. Electric vehicles, you get hybrid electrics, now you get plug-in hybrids, battery electrics. Those will come in slowly. I mean, the hybrids have been in the market, I don't know, 15 years now. It's only up to 3% market share. But with battery progress, we could move to a point where the other major market for oil drops out of the pot. So then with the geopolitical changes on the supply of natural gas and oil, and then the major changes that could happen on the switching between the energy forms that we have, it could be a whole new world. And we were talking earlier about development in Saudi Arabia. One of the, we've heard, you probably all heard this before, the statement that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. Neither will the oil age end because we've gone out of oil. Well, that really can be happening in my lifetime, not the lifetime just of you students here, but in my lifetime. It's really some dramatic things that could really happen. And we in North America are in the middle of that, and we've got to make policy recognizing that. So I fully agree with what Michael's saying there.
But you're also seeing a decline in consumption in the United States already. It's up,
right.
not,
That's
but,
right.
but
And
five.
projected to continue to decline, largely due to energy efficiency.
Yeah.
When in 1974, when the Federal Energy Administration was started, and they were first debating the first corporate average fuel efficiency standards, the CAFE standards, the average car on the road got 12 miles per gallon of gasoline. Now it gets over, I'll say over 24. Envision going from 12 to 24, that halves the amount of oil that you use per mile. To do the same thing, you have to go from 24 to infinity, to not using any at all. So we've already made tremendous strides, but that's beginning to happen. We're going, the move to 57 miles per gallon right now, meeting the California standards, is so close to that infinity that's going to be really, there's part of that graph I showed of why we're having less and less oil imported here is both the domestic production and the consumption, and those two are working right together.
Well, while we're on the subject of geopolitical implications, think about China in that context, both in terms of their needs, the horrible CO2 emission problems they have today, their ability to access natural resources in Africa, potentially South America, and what they are able to do in terms of developing their own shale oil and gas resources. They've got them. It's a question of how accessible they are. Do we help them with the technology to develop them? But a big piece of what we're wrestling with China today has to do with how they're going to deal with energy from an internal standpoint.
One of the things that was mentioned by George and by Carla and Jaime and Michael was trying to understand what the other party to this has. The Chinese are, concerns are the wrong word, are paying attention to the global issues around CO2 emissions. But their big problem is local pollution. Yeah. It's killing a lot of people. It's immense. Anybody who's been in Beijing recently or in Shanghai. So these are much bigger problems that are leading to a lot of protests among Chinese people. So they're going to have to do a lot of cleaning up, which may be done in ways that have a byproduct of dealing with this. But I don't think CO2 emissions is the main energy efficiency or environmental problem on there. Maybe highest on our list because it depends on global emissions and we care about that. But they're dealing with their own local, horrible local pollution problems.
Mary, you have been anxious for some time.
No, I just wanted, well, actually I have a question for Jim and for Jaime, but Jaime, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the politics of this change in Mexico, because it seems to me like Peña Nieto has been really on the forefront of it. I mean, I interviewed him when he was still a candidate, and he talked about, in very vague terms, because he knew it was kind of dangerous, but he said he was basically going to go there. And so certainly he's behind it, but I've heard, and actually I included a quote in my piece today, that his leadership on the issue, in the opinion of a lot of people, falls short of what Mexico really needs. Now, I was just wondering what your opinion is on that, because obviously it was the third rail for so long, and so you would have to congratulate him, I guess, in a way. But do you think that there's a national energy narrative that's going on that is what Mexico needs at this point? And specifically, like on the point of the fiscal reform, okay, it is true that the fiscal reform, there's like compensation in the reform for the loss of revenues, but wouldn't it be better to market the change as an increase, as in a more dynamic way, as instead of scoring it like statically, like we're going to lose? Certainly the expectation is you're going to get a huge flow of new investment, right? So between the royalties and all of that activity, then the government, I think the expectation is in the end you're going to have more money, right? People are going to be better off in a variety of different ways. The government will have more, the industry will have more capital, manufacturing will have access to cheaper energy, and Mexico will become more competitive. That doesn't seem
More
to be
jobs
in the.
with better pay.
It doesn't seem to be in the dialogue, really.
You're absolutely right. There are two things that I'm surprised are not in the dialogue. Is this sort of potential growth effect, and therefore its consequences on the fiscal accounts. And the second one, which, Mary, I don't think if you have concentrated on that, but I would invite you to think about that, is that Pemex is not only a monopoly, it's also a monopsony. And the distortions that monopsony has introduced are huge. Because for a person to be a supplier or a provider to Pemex, it's more important who do you know than how do you know. How you call it? Know who, know how? It's much more relevant, know who. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the lack of efficiency in all the supply mechanism to the monopsony is huge. When that changes, and then you have private companies buying all the inputs that you need in the oil industry, the who you know is not going to be as relevant as how well you do it. As it's not going to be as relevant as how well you know it. And I think that American firms are going to create a multiple effect on suppliers that are going to come into the industry. So not only the competitors to Pemex, but also their suppliers, which is huge change. And eventually, Pemex is going to have to resort to those suppliers as well. The second one is that the tax regime that Pemex has today is impossible. So if you want to have private guys with a normal tax regime, you're going to have to change the tax regime for Pemex as well, because it would be unfair for Pemex to try to compete with Exxon if Exxon pays less taxes. The potential tax loss there is huge. So gradually they're going to have to adjust to all of this. And probably the effect of growth and development of the industry will come up with enough resources to compensate for that. But the decision to lower the tax rates to Pemex is before, not after. And that's the complicated part.
And if you look at some of the numbers I showed, it's tempting to say the differences between those is a lot to do with the economic decisions they're making. But I want to go a little bit that direction because I view this sort of a tale of two countries in some sense. Both of them are resource rich. Both of them have been players in the energy game. One's declining in what they're doing, the other's growing much more effectively. And I think at least a significant part of it is not the trade regime, but the economic regime of incentives internally and the rules of the game that is making a difference. And I think in some sense you can use the numbers, with a little care to show that there is a tale of two countries there.
I think one thing to keep in mind, to follow on something Jaime said, is that the tax rate on Pemex is on gross value of production, and it's about the highest in the world. I think Syria may have a higher tax rate than Mexico, but Mexico's close. So if you allow foreign companies in, you're going to have to give them a lower tax rate, or they're not going to enter, and that's going to would have a huge impact in the short run on the government's ability to raise taxes.
Because my understanding, but you know more of this than me, but the contracts are going to be offered by the federal government, not by Pemex. So if I'm Exxon and I get a contract, then I'm competing with Pemex, right?
Yeah, that's the whole.
So if the tax regime I have is different from the one Pemex has, it's impossible. And it's also impossible to ask Exxon to have the same regime that we have for Pemex. So the tax regime for Pemex is going to have to adjust.
Well, I agree with that, but I mean, I think, for example, just in talking about how the narrative could be approached, I mean, if because of that, right, the government's basically sucking all the money out of Pemex and there was not enough reinvestment, so the output is going like that. Cantarell is a goner, there's no, so, I mean, you can argue, oh, look at all this tax revenue we're losing, but in fact, there's no way for the industry to survive on the current trajectory that it's on, and that just doesn't seem to be in the
That's
narrative
really
that
the point,
much.
and that is happening fast. You look at these.
The pre is using it, but not as clearly as you describe it.
Can I just ask you can I ask one more question? I don't know.
The chairman here will allow us.
Sure, no,
Thank
it's good
you.
to have a robust discussion. That's what we're trying to. That's why we have it in this room rather than a more cavernous place.
There was an article in the Journal last week that talked about environmental companies blocking permits for rail cars, and did anyone happen to see that? Basically, it said that they're trying to block the ability of oil to be transported by rail through certain, there was.
Internationally, across national
No,
borders?
this is in the U.S. And I think one example was going from somewhere in the, what we like to call flyover country to the West Coast. And but anyway, I was just wondering if you see that as a danger, because if they shut down pipelines and then there's more and more pressure on permitting for railroads, how are we going to get the oil around?
I think that those who are falling on their swords now will continue to fall on their swords for any mechanism that brings it across the national border. But there are existing rail cars, and it is legal to bring oil across the national border in rail cars. But I would think that's more likely if this really gets shut down, you're going to have shipments outside of Canada to Asia.
But this story is about just
It's
within the U.S.
ism. I'm just not aware of it. That.
Okay, thanks.
That's not on my radar screen either, but it may well be happening.
Montana, this is an issue. Montana and Idaho.
By the states, yeah, could be.
An
But is
intrastate?
that coal then, rather than
No,
oil?
it's
That's
oil. It's oil. It had a whole list of.
There was a story because I don't remember the type name of the oil, the cotton oil?
The back in
oil.
Back.
So as Canadian regulators have been trying to figure out about what happened during the rail derailment and why it was so explosive, they were using U.S. information. So the U.S. regulators are becoming concerned about the Bakken oil is so volatile because of the extra gas that's inside of it. So it's much more dangerous to ship by rail.
I don't know.
So,
Beyond my pay
So
grade.
Canadians are very aware of it, and they're aware of it because U.S. regulators are helping them.
It's much more flammable.
It's much more flammable. There's something in it that's making it more flammable.
Well, it is an important issue. Different types of energy have very different flammability thresholds and combustibility thresholds. Gasoline is an order of magnitude less flammable and combustible than hydrogen, for example. So these are issues of any type of energy. You have to always deal with the safety kinds of things. Dan and Lorenzo both early on emphasized these dynamic effects, particularly innovation. And I think that's an additional thing that should be said to Mary's point and others about the dynamics of this, not just for revenue and production, but for the society. That is, there's been a starvation of reinvestment in Mexico, but also the technology frontier is so far beyond where Pemex is, so far beyond where they are. And Mexico has large potential reserves in the Gulf that aren't being exploited, et cetera, that they need. I'm going to come back to shale, that they need foreign firms to have that technology, be able to access it reasonably and more or less safely, although there's risk to everything. And on the shale side, something I know a fair amount about, there's a lot of shale in a lot of places. There's a lot in Poland, there's a lot in Mexico, there's a lot in China. But in most of those places, we really don't know how much is really relatively easily commercializable. It's not just building transport networks and things of that sort and pipelines and so on, but just the rock formations and the geology of all that. You know, you don't just do the fracking and it automatically everywhere is the same. It differs a lot. So I was just wondering if you know anything about, have there been any advances recently in studying that in Mexico? But it would seem to me that would be a high priority.
Very little,
Yeah.
because of the debate. But the people that are interested in shale think that the shale basin that is connected to Texas is exactly the same. So the potential there is huge. But Pemex has done almost none. I mean, probably a little research or something, but they have not addressed the issue because the guys don't have enough money yet. Because the people don't have enough, I mean, Pemex doesn't have enough money to do this. We've been starving the investment, the CapEx, the capital expenditures of Pemex dramatically over the last years. So very little work, serious work, and knowledge from foreigners that there is quite a bit there because of the connection with the Texas basin.
Okay. Well, thank you all for a provocative, interesting, and in my view, very useful session. I learned a fair amount.
Can I just add one thing for the students up here? For those of you who are interested in thinking about energy, there's enough complications here that can make your mind hurt for the rest of your career if you work on it. So work on it. It's worth doing.
Yeah, it'll be an annuity. George?
I think that North America has really arrived. But it is possible to mess it up. This Keystone decision could do it. At the last North America Forum meeting in Mexico City, the Canadian delegation there, which were, I thought, normally very sensible people, they practically regarded it as an act of war. It's just going to be retribution of some kind. It's not going to be just taken lightly. So, and no doubt there are other things that could make things go wrong, but I think it is so promising a development, and there's such interesting things going on that could make it work better, that it's really important to try to keep this together, which certainly we're going to try to do.
Let me just make one point. You used the phrase an act of war. People are not looking at, let me qualify that. There are a lot of people who are looking at this strictly as business. It's not a question of emotion saying the bloody Americans are doing this or not doing that. They're just saying, look, do what you're going to do, but what you're going to do has consequences. We cannot leave a resource that is generating close to $100 billion a year of exports in the ground. So we're going to push them somewhere, and really the ball is in the U.S. court right now to decide which way they want to go. But we have to then take a business decision as to where what the consequences are on this one project. Because, as I said, we have 2 million barrels of oil still to come, and we don't have the capacity to move it all down here, so we're going to have to look at moving it elsewhere. And once those decisions are taken, they will be based on long-term contracts. So it's not something that you can just reverse. The pipeline companies will not get the financing unless they have contracts for at least a significant part of the production that they'll be able to carry.